I occasionally get asked by people why I talk so much about boring academic stuff like media literacy. And honestly, I wonder that myself sometimes, usually when checking out my bank account balance, because it would be so much more lucrative to whip up anger about minorities or spread conspiracies and dumb down everything to mislead people, because that's how algorithms work these days. But that's not how my brain works. And when I was 17, I actually petitioned my rural high school to put in a media studies class and was told by our school guidance counsellor at the time that, and these are her words, no one needs to know about what the media does. It's not important because most of the students there are just going to end up working on their parents' farm and voting for National. But I still believe giving people the tools to understand how media works is one of the best ways to stop politicians manipulating media and therefore the public, and to stop media being complicit in being manipulated by politicians and bad faith actors. And this week's news stories around ACT are actually the perfect example of this, because there's been several moving parts that a bit of media literacy can pick out and say, here's how we can show how our media has a right-wing bias, saying that upsets trolls, but also how that manipulates the voters. Take the announcement yesterday of Paul Henry as a candidate. Big live streams, headline news, it dominated the news cycle. So this gives us a chance to see how media choose to frame this information, the language they use and the context that they focus on. Now, before I do this, for comparison, consider Green Party candidate Mikhail Molipola. When he was announced, his views and past actions were framed as bad, even violent. They were specifically framed this way by ACT themselves, and media used that specific framing. And there are some Green Party and Te Pāti Māori candidates that I know of personally who refuse to work with mainstream media because in the past their actions have been framed as violent, negative, or been represented in what they considered a misleading way. So, how did media frame someone with a long history of being offensive on air that included suggesting asylum seekers should be starved, making fun of people's names, calling homosexuality unnatural, deliberately making fun of a guest's appearance to undercut their message, which he didn't agree with, using the R word to describe people, and questioning the right of brown people to be Governor General because they didn't match his view of what a New Zealander should look like? Well, initially, 8 of the news stories that cropped up just after the announcement, only 2 mentioned any kind of controversy. One was Wellington-based The Post, which is probably the most political of all Stuff's outlets, but Stuff didn't follow through with that. The other was Awaz, which is a news outlet focusing on media for migrant communities. The rest either used a statement of fact or used his own words to frame the story, which was also how ACT framed the announcement. Radio New Zealand described him as a veteran broadcaster, and Stuff framed it as a salvo at the Prime Minister, which they continued with their framing the next day of the same topic, as this headline about how charming and witty Paul Henry is sat just below their masthead. None of the mainstream media seems to be asking how migrant communities, particularly Indian communities, feel about Paul Henry with his track record of racism against Indians, running in a coalition party that just last week told Winston Peters to stop being racist towards Indians for votes. He's been given a pass by media and not held to account for his past actions. But Mikhail from the Greens was, and there's examples of this framing being used repeatedly, particularly by ACT. Remember when David Seymour claimed a joke by Rawiri Waititi about karaka berries was threatening violence? Media framed that as Seymour demanding an apology, but a year later it was just a joke about blowing up the Ministry of Pacific People that he doesn't need to apologise for, which actually led to people abusing ministry staff and attempting to access sensitive information from them. Winston Peters gets up on the tiles to harass a Green MP based on rumours from a Twitter troll, and media frame it as Peters questioning Green MPs, deleted social media posts. But that led to what was later described as a tsunami of hate and threats that were so violent that Benjamin Doyle no longer felt that they could keep themselves or their families safe. Even the announcement of New Zealand First's candidates, which include parliamentary protest attendees, online Twitterati who often resort to violent threats and lying, and candidates who have called for harm against those who don't believe the conspiracy theories that they do, has been met with stories like, here's a candidate running in an electorate 200 kilometres away from where she lives. Isn't that quirky? So, framing is one key way that we can see how media pushes specific views and ideologies. But also, knowing specific techniques that parties use to get the narrative that they want is important. Paul Henry's sudden announcement was sudden for a reason, and it's dominated news cycles. One of the things that came through in the announcement was that everything had been planned and ratified the night before the announcement. The same day, former ACT Party President Tim Jago pleaded guilty to even more child sexual assault charges. In 2023, Jago was granted name suppression specifically because it was argued his name being public would impact ACT's ability to be elected. He's tried several times since then to get the conviction overturned, and he's denied more claims that have come forward, but on the 13th of this month, he pled guilty to more charges. Also on the 13th, Paul Henry was quickly made a candidate for ACT. On the 14th, ACT has this big press conference. Paul Henry's name is everywhere in the news, and the story about Jago wasn't published in media until just after the start of the 6 p.m. news, and was off the front page by the morning of the 15th. But Paul Henry was still there. This is what we call swinging the dead cat in media literacy, because a dead cat being thrown around is suddenly the only thing the media focuses on. Paul Henry being rushed through and presented as a candidate stopped media coverage of Tim Jago. When Jago's name was first released after name suppression finally lapsed, the Treaty Principles Bill had just started public submissions, and the intense interest on that took away focus on Jago and his connections to ACT. Seymour played up his treatment at Waitangi. Within a week of it being revealed, he had referred Jago's victims to an employment lawyer. David Seymour drove up the steps of Parliament in a Land Rover when it was revealed that Seymour had written a letter in support of Philip Polkinghorne. When it was revealed he'd been Snapchatting teenagers, and reports from within his now 2023 election campaign came through as toxic, divisive and dangerous, he surprised people again with Paul Henry at their 2024 conference and talked about how he was so approachable and successfully outreaching to future voters who his own government has made it harder for them to actually vote this year. There's a clear pattern of ACT swinging a dead cat when news crops up that makes them and their leader look bad, and our media facilitating it time after time after time, and not just with ACT, with all of the coalition. It's why fresh acknowledgement of horrific abuse from within the ACT Party hierarchy isn't on the front page, but media are running stories about Paul Henry's greatest hits, like he's a charming larrikin and you don't need to know about anything otherwise. You know, like those kids that I went to high school with, according to my old school guidance counsellor, who were always just going to avoid thinking for themselves and blindly do what they've always done. Which is why I've always felt that we need more media literacy in our lives. Hello there, Kia ora podcast listeners. I'm using the filming setup because I just couldn't be arsed switching cameras and stuff like that today. I'm kind of annoyed at this one because I'd actually fully recorded it yesterday in the afternoon, and then in the evening the news came out about Tim Jago, and I knew at the time that there must have been a distraction because of how fast everything was moving, and by the time the evening rolled around, it's like, oh, that's what the distraction is. Because ACT do this on a really, really regular basis. And our media falls for it on a really, really regular basis. And there's a lot of reasons for that. You know, it's about, if it bleeds, it leads, and conflict and stuff like that. And what's going to get the most clicks drives news, which means that you lose some of that in-depth contextualizing in news that we just don't get in a 2-minute soundbite at 6 p.m, for example, or a quick piece that you find on social media. It's one of the reasons why, for me, it is so important that audiences go out there and they follow online creators at the moment in the space, because in a lot of ways, they're giving you that depth that you don't necessarily find in more traditional news places. And I think there's still a place for more traditional news places, but I'd love to see them shift focus and give people more context so that they can make more decisions with more information. But looking through what I did yesterday versus today, there were a few changes, because obviously that Tim Jago announcement just after the 6 o'clock news had started, that contextualizes a lot of what's in today's piece. In yesterday's piece, it was more about other ways that people were fawning over Paul Henry. And to be fair, I know full well ACT is going to be sitting there hoping that a bunch of creators go out and go, oh my God, Paul Henry, ooh, and use that to push their narrative that they're the outsiders, that the woke leftists like. So I don't want to do that. But there was some interesting stuff that came through about Paul Henry specifically that I couldn't get into this one. I just couldn't find a way to fit it in. And one of them was actually a story by Julie Ferry. Julie is a Auckland City Councillor, absolutely lovely. I ended up actually having a really long conversation with her in a tent in the rain earlier this year about all sorts of things. And one of the things that she did before she was a councillor was online blogging content around unions and left-wing stuff. She's very into that kind of media sphere. And there was a story a few years ago about Paul Henry making fun of a Greenpeace staff member because she showed up on air with a moustache. And Paul Henry made fun of her looks and distracted specifically from the message that she was delivering. he did that on purpose because he started the interview off by talking, or before the interview, saying he didn't agree with what it was that they were saying. And so this was clearly a distraction to pull away from the important message that she was delivering. And it was a horrific way of doing it. It was a horrible way of downplaying and manipulating audiences and vilifying somebody and making them a victim that they didn't need to be. And then the news reported, Paul Henry told other reporters in the newsroom that he'd apologized. And so news ran with that. But he hadn't. Julie knew the person through somebody else, like they had mutual connections, reached out and asked specifically, did Paul Henry apologize? And the answer was no. Didn't say a thing. So she reported this in her blog. Media uncritically platform Paul Henry because he's an insider. And that's one of the reasons why he gets away with so much and being so offensive. And part of the reason why the fawning that we've seen over the last 24 to 48 hours on him running is really, well, it's really fawning. There's very little criticism or critical approach to it or contextualizing. Excuse me. And that is a problem because every candidate should be critically approached and contextualized in that way. They didn't do that with Mikhail Molipolo when he was announced, and they're not doing that here, but in different ways, really different ways. And the framing is really specifically being led by ACT and framed around by ACT. We need to do better. So I wanted to contextualize this and the way that I put it forward, specifically talking about what I went through in high school. That's a genuine true story as well about what I went through in high school, which is kind of scary. But there's also an addendum to that, which I find, which no place here, but I can do it in the podcast section. That a couple of years after I left high school, and I was studying at the University of Waikato in the Screen and Media department there, we got this email come through from the school going, we'd love to bring students around and show them, what you can study in media, what sort of careers are out there, what you can learn. Do you have anybody who'd be willing to help out? And I put my hand up straight away, like, yes, I want to do that because one, this is my old high school, and two, I think it's really important that we show students what they can actually do in the field. And so I did the tour and everything, showed them the studio spaces and took them into a couple of guest lectures and things like that, got them thinking, and that was really cool. And the very final thing that we did was we took them into an edit suite in the basement of, I think it was J Block, and we started a Q&A session after I'd showed them some student work. And one of the questions that cropped up is, where did I come from? What was my story for getting there? I was like, well, I went to the school you did, and that woman over there that's here guiding you around, she told me it was impossible to study this topic, and I really wanted just to prove her wrong. And she sat there going, I don't remember you. And I'm like, yeah, that sounds about right. Te Awa moved to college. I wasn't a sports star, so I probably wasn't important. Yeah. Anyway, that's a bit of a rambling podcast edition for you. I really do hope that with the right tools, people can start thinking a lot more critically about what information they're being presented and how they're being manipulated. And if you don't already, please go out there and follow a bunch of other creators in this space. And I'm sure you do. I'm really sure most of you do. But those creators are giving you different elements of context. And that's really important when it comes to getting a fuller picture of what's going on. It's what we call lateral reading. Different perspectives on the same topics. So please go do that. Give them a follow. And if you haven't already, maybe learn a little bit more about media literacy. And with that, you can learn a little bit more about how you're being manipulated. That's not cool. All right, I'll talk to you guys later, okay? I'm running out of voice here. So until next time, ka kite anō. I will see you guys all tomorrow.